Hello, I'm Julia Fisher, and you're listening to The Olive Tree, the program that introduces you to believers living in Israel and the West Bank, Jews, Arabs, and Palestinians. David Zadok has an unusual story. Today, he's the director of a publishing house. He's also the pastor of a Messianic congregation in a town just a few miles south of Tel Aviv. He was born in Israel, but when still a very young child, his parents took him to Iran and left him there. David takes up the story.
Yes, actually, I think I should go one generation back. Both my parents, for many generations, are Iraqis. And I sometimes jokingly say that my ancestors were those Jewish people that after they were allowed to come back and to rebuild Jerusalem, there were some who decided to stay. And maybe my ancestors were part of that remnant that they decided to stay in Babylon, today's Iraq. But when during the Second War, a little bit before the Second War, in the late 30s and early 40s, when the persecution against the Jews started, the family had to leave Iraq. Part of my family basically crossed the border, went to Iran, and part of the family came to Israel, what was really basically just a young state of Israel in 1949-50. But at the time, my grandmother, she was 19 years old, and she became a widow. In fact, she was pregnant with my father when her husband passed away, so my dad never saw his father. But having two small children and being a widow, the relatives felt that she can't raise them both. So my dad was taken with the rest of the family to Israel. And my grandmother and his sister, my aunt, crossed the border to Iran. Eventually they came looking for each other. After some years, on the second trip, they found each other, and by then both my dad and my aunt were married. After my sister and my brother were born, I was 2.5 years old. My mom decided to come to Iran and to visit their relatives. And we ended up being there for about 9 months, which at the end of those 9 months, my mom decided to allow me to stay with my uncle and aunt, that they didn't have any children and were even considering divorcing each other. So my dad and mom thought that they can really help save their marriage, and that's how I ended up in Iran.
They gave you away?
In looking at it, humanly speaking, they gave me away. But looking at it from God's perspective, and the sovereignty of God, that was the way that God used to pave the way for me to hear the gospel some years later.
So what were those early years like for you in Iran? Presumably you had to learn Farsi and you were educated there?
Yeah, I was very small, so the language wasn't a problem. I spoke it very quickly, and I attended a Jewish school. In our school there was a synagogue. We had a good life. All our neighbors knew that we were Jewish. We would celebrate all the festivals. We would keep kosher. Under the Shah, we had a relatively very good life, enjoyable life. We could travel to Israel very easily and freely, unlike today. And life was good.
So happy memories, but then it all changed.
It all changed actually in two cases. The first case was in 1973, during the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur War. My uncle that I was living with, he lost his nephew in a very tragic situation up in the Golan Heights in one of the tank units. And that event impacted him so much that he said he would do everything he can that I would not serve in the Israeli army. And only about 4 years later was when the revolution started, and as things were getting worse, I was contacted by the Israeli consulate in Tehran saying that I need to be ready with a very small suitcase, and in case things would get worse, they would airlift all the Israelis back to Israel. And when my uncle heard that, he got very nervous, and he decided to get me out of Iran as soon as possible. And in those days, a lot of Jewish people would either send their kids to UK or to USA to study and to get a better education. And again, in God's sovereignty, I received an application from San Diego, California, in a high school, in a dormitory with the high school with a dormitory. And so, having been born in Israel, living in Iran at the age of 16 and a half, I ended up flying by myself almost halfway across the globe to San Diego, California.
Was that something that you enjoyed, or was it something that was really very difficult for you?
Well, I think it was probably more difficult. There was obviously some excitement going to the States, to America, but there were a lot of anxiety because the situation in Iran was very unstable. And my uncle and aunt and my grandmother and many of our other relatives were staying behind. So there was a mixed feeling, much anxiety, but also a lot of expectation.
Was that the last time you were to go to Iran?
Unfortunately, yes, that was the last time. Eventually, after some years, both my uncle and aunt and my grandmother and all of our relatives eventually left Iran. So in a sense, my grandmother was a very true example of the wandering Jew, because in her lifetime, twice, she had to leave the countries that she considered her country, her homeland. So the first time was, of course, Iraq, and the second time was Iran. And it was only here that she arrived and she felt that this is home.
You say that looking back, you can see that the hand of God was on your life. When did you become aware of that?
I think I became aware of it at the very initial stages, where some of my friends, while I was attending the high school, shared the gospel with me. And I recall very clearly at the end of the long conversation, it was a Bible study held by the navigators. And after they shared the gospel with me, after the Bible study, I remember very clearly the first question I asked myself, I said, well, if this is true, then how is it that for so many years, nobody in my family, not in Iran, not in Israel, not in anywhere else that I know, have ever told me that or know this story? And it wasn't really praying, but I kind of said to my heart, I said, God, if this is true, reveal yourself to me. And then my friends, at the end of that discussion, they told me, if you want to know more, read the Gospel of John. And I had no idea what they were talking about, but about a month before that event, God miraculously provided me with the New Testament, which I was going to throw it away, but since I saw that it has the Old Testament, I couldn't throw it away, I kept it. So when I came back home, I started to read for the first time, holding the New Testament, looking for the Gospel of John, and I began reading. And it was really as if God is putting a big puzzle, or making a big puzzle. Each time I would read a passage from the New Testament, and I would recall some of the things that I heard from my grandmother or synagogue, or read the Old Testament. And every time another piece would fall exactly in its place. And after 6 months, I was convinced that Jesus is the promised Messiah. And it took me about probably another, after 6 months, I think 6 or 7 months, I was baptized. But it took me another probably year or two to realize, to put all of these things together. It kind of reminds me of what we read in Romans 9, 10, and 11 about God's plan of salvation for the people of Israel, that it was a progressive plan. And so that's how I realized that God has brought me all these stations so that I would get to the place that I would hear the gospel and be converted and come to here. Your
uncle didn't want you to come back to Israel, but you did in fact come back, and you did in fact join the army.
Yes, actually, ironically, I spent about 16 of my years in active duty in the Israeli army. I was a major in the army, and for many years I did a reserve duty. And I really believe that God has brought us here. He has restored the Hebrew language, and also He's restored us back to the land, to the Holy Land, the Promised Land. And the restoration of the Hebrew language and the restoration of the land has paved the way for the restoration of the people. And that's why I had no problem spending so much time in the military defending the country, because I believe that God has brought us here for a very, very important purpose, and that is that to bring the gospel to all people. And as Paul has promised, that one day all Israel shall be saved.
Do you think that day is far off?
It's hard to say, but I think that for one thing, just as each day that passes by we get closer to the return of Christ, I believe in the same way as each day is passing, we're getting close to that day where all Israel would be saved. But also, living here in Israel, we are seeing more and more of what wonderful things are happening in Israel. Just the number of congregations growing, people are more and more involved in different ministries. Israel College of the Bible is doing a great job of training those people who would serve in the very, very near future and are already serving the congregations. So in that sense, I really feel that we are very close to that. But in God's eyes, very close can be a few centuries or a few years, and it can be a few days.
David Zadok sharing his story. And you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab and Palestinian Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you would like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either visit our website, olivetreefund.org, or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, PO Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA in the UK. Do join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.